you're just joining us, we were talking about how today I brought up that in Canada, they have to legally play at least 50% Canadian artists on their radio stations, something like that. It's also kind of the reason why you do hear about certain Canadians loving specific bands that we just are like, what? It's because they're basically subjected to it the entire time.
Notice something
for so long.
strange. They play a lot of Canadian music, like a lot. Like 1 in 3 songs is by a Canadian artist.
That's actually crazy.
At least.
All broadcast TV
And,
too.
well, I wish I could say that this was just fierce patriotism of my country. That's not actually the case. The real reason so many Canadian radio stations play acts from their motherland is because they're legally required to.
That's
thanks
actually
to regulations
crazy to me.
dating back to 1971. Let's take a closer
That's not
look.
respecting art. Oh, and real quick,
The 1960s were
just because everybody's mad about React content. This is by Polyphonic, and the video is called Canada's Weird Radio Laws. Everyone, okay? If you want to watch the video, you have the link. It's in the chat.
an exciting time for radio. Rock and roll was in the middle of a golden age, and FM broadcasting was starting to get a foot in the mainstream. At the same time, portable radios were getting better in quality, and more and more young people were buying cars. And of course, this explosion was happening in Canada too. But the music that young Canadians were blaring through their radios wasn't from their home country. Instead, Canadian radio stations focused mostly on the music scenes in the US and Great Britain. That was great for the listeners because there was a lot of incredible music coming out of those scenes, but it wasn't quite as great for Canadian bands.
Yeah, no one does care.
In the mid-60s, acts like Gordon Lightfoot and the Guess Who were finding some success on the Canadian charts.
True.
But as we
Where
got
are the
deeper into
Canadian
the decade,
cards?
we saw much less Canadian music. Only a few Canadian acts were really having success, and even those that were doing so in the States. Neil Young was working with Buffalo Springfield, who were based
I had
out
no
of
idea
Los
that
Angeles
Buffalo
and made
Springfield
up
was from
mostly
Canada.
Americans. Another Los Angeles band, Steppenwolf, had some better Canadian representation, with 3 out of 5 members being Canadian. But in 1968, Steppenwolf were the only Canadian band to top the Canadian charts, though they did it twice with Born to be Wild.
Why is that so
and
loud?
Magic Carpet Ride. That year marked an all-time low for Canadian music success. Only 7 different Canadian songs cracked RPM's Canadian top 40.
The only reason
that
I know
year.
them is because that song was the theme of, I believe it was like NASCAR 2004, all right?
With only 4 even breaking the top 10. Even more worrying was the fact that those 7 songs were put out by just 4 different artists. Steppenwolf,
Wait, All-Time
the Irish
Low is
Rovers,
Canadian?
Andy Kim,
I didn't know
and the
that.
Stampeders. It was quickly becoming clear that Canadian radio just wasn't interested
at
in
an
playing
all-time
Canadian
low.
songs,
Oh, I see,
which
I
was
see.
posing a threat to the country's music industry as a whole. However, the same year that local chart success bottomed out, the Canadian government created the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, better known as the CRTC. That organization was charged with regulating broadcast and telecommunications.
That's so
and one of their
crazy.
mandates was to help support more Canadian content. While there was an upswing in local music on Canadian radio in the following years, most of it was still acts that had found success in the States first, like Anne Murray and the Guess Who. The CRTC organized a public hearing process to investigate, and out of that came a system called the Maple System. That was created by Stan Cleese, who had just created the Juno Awards. And a quick aside
I've
for
heard
those
of
of you
that.
who aren't Canadian, the Juno Awards are basically the Canadian Grammys, kind of. The Maple System was a way of qualifying what counted as Canadian content. It consisted of 4 aspects.
Of course it's called Maple.
Music. The music was composed entirely by a Canadian.
It would
Artist.
be, right?
The music or lyrics were performed mostly by a Canadian. Performance. The performance was either recorded, performed, or broadcast in Canada. Lyrics. The lyrics were written entirely by a Canadian. In order to qualify as Canadian content, a piece
That's
needed
crazy.
to fulfill 2 of these conditions, or just one if it was recorded before January 1972. With the Maple System defined, the CRTC set up regulations. 25%
Yeah, this
of
sounds
all
like a
airplay
joke.
needed to be devoted to Canadian music. In the years since, that quota has increased, with most contemporary radio stations getting licensed at 40% Canadian content. The results were immediate. In 1972, 57 different songs cracked RPM's Canadian Top 40, with 3 topping the charts.
Of course it's called the Maple. So stupid. That's true. Linus did not need that
Even more
shortcut.
promising, the 70s saw the growth of Canadian content based out of Canada.
Out.
Bands like April Wine, Max Webster, and Trooper all found success on the Canadian airwaves throughout the 1970s.
Who is
These
this?
regulations weren't without controversy, of course. Many people thought it was out of line for the government to step in and tell people what they should and shouldn't be listening to. Despite this, CanCon has continued to this day, and you can make a good argument that it's part of the reason Canada has been able to punch above its weight class on the musical scene.
Pretty
The
interesting.
1980s saw Bryan Adams become an international rock star, while the 90s created mega stars out of Canadians like Shania Twain, Celine Dion, and Alanis Morissette. And even
I
today,
didn't know
Canadian
Alanis
music is
Morissette is
bigger than ever.
Canadian.
Names like Drake, The Weeknd, and Justin Bieber have consistently topped charts throughout the last decade. It's not just chart success either. Canadian bands like Arcade Fire have become critically acclaimed in the last decade. And outside of international success, Canadian content, or CanCon, spawned countless groups that have had local success. Some of the biggest of these include Blue Rodeo, Great Big Sea, and Sam Roberts, who are all huge in Canada. And of course, the best example of this is the Tragically Hip, who became Canadian legends
Yeah, I had no
thanks
idea
to
Shania
CanCon
Twain
airplay. CanCon is an important piece of Canada's musical history. It allowed Canadian artists to thrive and find a footing in the world, despite living in the shadow of the cultural giant that is the United States. Love it or hate it, CanCon did its job.
Thanks, don't
and
soldier
personally,
voice, whole
I think
flow,
Canada
word for
and
word, bar
the
for
entire
bar.
music world are better for it. Hey guys, I want to thank you so much for watching, and I really want to thank my patrons. They're the reason I was able to do this bonus Canada Day.
Thank you, patrons. Yeah, if you want to see this video, check it out. Here's the original video. Yeah. Damn, this would be cool if I knew half of those people are. Yeah, that's kind of true. That's kind of true. Cool. Interesting. Yeah, the percentage requirement is wild to me. Like, it just seems like how difficult that would be to actually regulate that, but I mean, I'm sure everybody does it. Interesting. Anyways, yeah, that's like a lot. That is like way more than I expected there to be.